bring fresh acidity, a little bit more brightness to the table, where a lot of the red grapes, of course, have acidity as well, but they also bring a lot of the color. Now, to talk about the grape skin themselves and the color, we're talking about the phenolics, if you will, which are bled into the wine. So phenolics are in a really broad category, which tannin is included in, as well as color and aromatic compounds. So you get a lot of the aromatics out of rosé, also out of the skins, as well as like we just talked about, the depth of color. In addition, the juice itself was what brings a lot of the acidity to the table. So there's many attributes you could say for the juice that comes from the berry of the grape. So how is rosé made? Now I'm going to talk about the first one on the left, and there's 4 methods, but I'll talk on the one on the left first, right, a little bit, and give a brief overview. So the one on the left is called the direct press method. That's kind of the one that's most common in the region of Provence, and wines that end up being quite pale in color, maybe a little bit even lighter than this. They are harvested just the same way a red wine would be, and or white wine, essentially. But as soon as they are harvested, they are either destemmed, which is part of the process, which the berries are removed from the stem themselves, or they could be left in whole bunches, means that they're not destemmed and that there's still one big bunch. And then placed into a press, which would be, can you see my mouse move if I do this? Yeah, okay. So this would be a press. This would be the stripping, they're calling it here, which would be the kind of the destemmer, and then going into the press. So oftentimes presses are big vats like this that are circular. They could, mostly of the time they're circular and cylinder. They're like a big cylinder that have a bladder inside that expands like this and pushes and presses the berries against the outer walls. So what results in that is that generally the skins remain there, and the juice from the berries falls straight down and it's caught. So in this method is generally conducted very, very slowly, and with the red grapes touching the juice very slowly. Only a little bit of color is allowed to be extracted. And once that is done, it could be done in anywhere from 2 hours up to 20 hours, depending on how slow, is how much color extraction can be from the berries. At that point, essentially the production is exactly like a white wine. So there would be a period of clarification where they let the solids kind of run down, move the juice from the solids, and then fermentation starts with either wild yeast or inoculated with yeast. And from there, settled, aged if a winemaker wants to age, but it could be a very quick process from harvest to bottling with this. And generally, the last thing that's done with this process is filtration. And with most of these, like white wine, the last thing that happens right before bottling is filtration, just to make sure that there's no secondary fermentations that happen in the bottle, or if there's any residual sugar that gets filtered out, basically. So that's the direct press method, which was most common in Provence. Probably the method that's most commonly used is the one on the right here. It's called the maceration. So as you can imagine, basically that's the method of just allowing your grapes to be in contact with your juice for a little bit longer bit of the time. So different than the direct press, where the contact is happening right at the point of the press pushing out, the maceration method, the grapes have already been crushed a little bit, and then everything put into a vat together. And you can imagine this, I like to think of the analogy of this as like a French press, where with French press coffee, where you have the grounds of your coffee and they're all floating on top, and you have your liquid down below, and eventually, the coffee is basically seeping into the liquid below, but you use basically a press, a vessel, to keep the solids in one spot and then the removal of the liquid going to another spot after it's already been leaked in a bit. And so you have a rosé color there. Now, you could see the colors here are widely varied. It could be very, very pale. So this could be just up to 2 hours of contact with the skins, or it could be, you know, much, much darker in color. So there's a lot of control in this method for a winemaker to say, I want to make a paler style, or I want to make a more dark style rosé. A method that's not so common, and it's more, has two motives about it, is the saignée method. Now, you could think of saignée as you get two products in one. Basically, the whole methodology of saignée is to make a red wine. And a byproduct of this red wine is a rosé, and I'll explain that in just a second. So everything that's happening going into the process of winemaking is for red wine and the future of it. And many winemakers or many regions or appellations love a wine that's really muscular and really full-bodied. And to encourage that happening a little bit more, they use this method. So essentially, it's kind of like the last method that we just talked about, but you're making two products. So you're having the skins are in contact with the juice. A lot of the color has already been bled out. But essentially, you take a little bit of the juice from this vat. You can see it here. You're taking a little bit, removing it, and then this becomes a rosé. What's left in this vat, which is a higher concentration of skins to juice whatever's left to make a red wine. So you have a really more full-bodied red wine here, but as a byproduct, you're also getting a rosé out of it. And saignée is a little bit more difficult to control. It's certainly, you get less of the rosé juice, and you basically get less of this juice too, but the result is a really full-bodied red wine. And this method is used in regions like, let's say, Rioja, or even around the regions of Campania that are using grapes like Aglianico, things that have a lot of color and are expected to be quite full-bodied, a method that they use here. It's also used in a little bit in sparkling wine production, which will often say saignée or rosé de saignée or something of that nature. Now, the last method, there's actually one more, but I'm not going to talk about it. So this one is let's say, call this the fourth and final method, which is just blending. And very simply said, is a base of white wine, majority white wine, blended with a touch of red wine to get a rosé in color. This is most commonly found in sparkling wines, and essentially is almost outlawed in most European countries, except for the production of sparkling wines, or highly frowned upon because it's just not necessarily a good practice. However, outside of Europe, it is a practice that is commonly used to make a rosé because you can control the color really easily, and it's inexpensive to do because you have two wines and you're just pushing them together. But this is how they make champagne. Some of the most expensive champagnes on the market are that of rosé. And essentially any other sparkling wine region in the world will use this method as well to make a rosé. Unless it says on the label it's a Blanc de Noir or Noir, you know, something that's the rosé of Noir. It means that it's only made with red grapes. It can be made with this method here, which is the blending of the two. I forgot to mention too, rosés can be fortified. It sounds crazy, but there are a couple brands on the market as well that there are rosé ports, so made from Portugal. They're fortified wines and they're very doctored, but they are pretty hip and trendy. Although I don't know anyone who's ever bought a bottle or anything, but I think it's good for making cocktails because of the color is quite fun. Any questions up to this point in time?
I wonder, with the blending method, is there a possibility to see or somehow recognize on the label or the name or anything if it's blended or produced with another method?
Generally, no. And you can basically count on, if you're buying a European rosé, that it's not going to be blended. It's either going to be the first two methods that I mentioned, although Saignée, usually producers that are producing in Saignée will somehow indicate it because it is a more laborious task, and it is a way that, you know, it sets your wine apart a little bit, but it's not always said either. So there's really no way to indicate unless the producer feels as if they want to share that information. But I'm always leery of wines, let's say from the US when I was there. I mean, the wines could be quite drinkable and nicely quaffable, but they could have been produced using the blending method. I would say, yes, it's an inferior way to do it, but it also results in a wine that's not necessarily terrible either.
Yeah. Is it usually less expensive?
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Okay. So what I like about rosé and a lot of things is that there's a style for everybody. I think I've heard many times is that there's, you know, I don't like rosé because it's too feminine, or it's too light for me, or it's you know, etc. There's a lot of things, but that person will drink white wines, but they'll drink red wines, but nothing in between. I love rosé because it's kind of in the middle and has the best of both worlds, if you will. So it's really dependent on the production and as a result. So I have a question here on the right, and I mean, how can color indicate style? And as you can imagine, the more this side, the longer the skins are in contact with the juice, the darker the wine, and generally the more full-bodied the rosé is, just generally speaking. The more this color, if you will, could be more delicate, more you know, light, of course, bright, acidic, and these are just generalizations. It doesn't mean that a wine that's dark will not have a lot of a lift and acidity to it as well, or, you know, refreshness. But you could often say that, you know, the darker you get, the more meaty and more kind of muscular it will be. So there's a style for everybody, I think. And quite honestly, there are wines that are much darker than this. For instance, like Ceresuolo d'Abruzzo or even Tavel, that are quite dark and that are full-bodied, I think, on the scale of things of the rosé scale. But again, a lot comes down to grape varieties, which I probably will save that for a little bit later. But there are better grape varieties than for making rosé than not. Let's say using the south of France for an example, they're generally grapes that are lighter in skin and have a lot of acidity to them. But the harvest time is quite affected, or creates the effect of a brighter style of rosé. So a lot of these wines where grapes that are intended to produce rosé will have be treated like a white wine. Basically, they'll be harvested a little bit earlier than normal, than a red wine would be, to retain a lot of the acidity to them. So you get best of both worlds. You get the color and aromatics of a red wine, but the acidity of a white. So it kind of makes rosé like the best all-around wine choice, in my humble opinion, but not necessarily always that. Also, too, I mean, there's a wine. It's a wine for everybody because there's a lot of options for cost. And there could be a €3 rosé, which could be totally fine. I've seen several of those, the Bardolino, the Chiretto, or hundreds of euros for a bottle of rosé, like some of these very collector wines like Domaine Haute from Provence. And those are the ones you see on the fancy yachts with celebrities. But it doesn't mean that every rosé has to be like that, that there is a wide range opportunities for everybody to kind of enjoy it. Also, too, rosé is very appealing for producers, and we'll see in a minute why this kind of craze and the growth of this segment happened. But it's really inexpensive for producers to get a rosé to the market. Essentially, they can go from harvest in, let's say, September or October, and have the wine bottled by no later than December. And then, if, let's say they're exporting to the United States, that the wine could be in a container and start the export process by February at the latest, to have it arrive in the United States by March and have it hit the market right away. So it's really quick cash flow for a lot of producers. But that is good and bad for several reasons. One, that they could just produce whatever, and it could be, mediocre to poor. Or, but on the good side, it keeps these small wineries up and going when they need the most, because to age red wine, of course, that takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of finances for them to age wine for several years before it's released into the market. So this rosé, the growth of the rosé has really been beneficial to a lot of producers and consumers alike. And for the most part, consumers like to drink the year in which is following. So now we're in 2020, perhaps we're drinking 2019 rosé, although I haven't seen too many, because I think our current situation, of course, is hindering that. But I think we'll start to see some here in the very near future. So let's see what's next. Okay. Very basic descriptors of aromas and flavors. And everyone, like looking at the screen earlier and trying to describe the color, there's a myriad of flavors and aromas that everyone could identify. In this wine that I'm drinking here, I think I've concluded, and we talked about it because I've had this producer's white wine, is that this smells like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc to me. So it's very grassy, which is not necessarily normal in a rosé, but it does. It could indicate that the yeast that they're using is creating a particular aromatic compounds. So what's screaming to me here is it's really grassy. It's fresh. It's kind of green bell pepper and cat pea, if you will. I hate to say that, but it kind of is. But it is very fresh and citrus driven. But many other rosés are in this realm of red fruits, strawberries, cherries, raspberries. This is a common descriptor, which is a Jolly Rancher. I'm not sure if they're available all over the world, but when I grew up, like, Jolly Ranchers were the thing, and sometimes wine is described as like the watermelon kind or the green apple. But then you're rolling into citrus as well, like mandarin and orange zest and various types of cherry. And then spices, not on here, I don't think, is like garrigue, like herbes de Provence, things like that. So oftentimes grapes will just kind of gather and collect the ambient aromas around them wherever they're grown. So sometimes the wines from the south of France can smell like lavender or rosemary, things of that nature. But there's a real floral component too to many of the great rosés too. Fruit, they're very delicate fruit blossoms, rose petals, white flowers, things of that nature. And then if you go up a few, cured meats, I mean, those are like your really hearty red wine like attributes, and they could be in those darker style of rosés. So the more skin contact, sometimes the more of these types of flavors can come out, which is also quite good. Many people really enjoy it. Now, the structural components, when I say structure, we talk about these 5 elements. So acidity, body, tannin, alcohol, and sweetness. In theory and hope that your rosé will be bright and it'll have a nice acidity to it. I think that's kind of the whole premise behind rosé wine, is that it's thirst quenching. It's great in the hot weather. I mean, I think that's kind of why it's been so popular in the south of France and in coastal regions in general, because it has a nice lift. And acidity doesn't always mean that it's going to be the driving force, but you certainly hope that it's one of the key elements in the structural components of wine that speaks the loudest, that you can, after you taste the wine, you salivate and you're like, okay, this is fresh, it's great. Body can range anywhere, like in color, like we talked about earlier. It could be very, very light or all the way up into full body. And sometimes that even blends into having tannin, where most white wines, of course, don't have tannin. Because there's skins involved in rosé wine, there is occasionally the opportunity to have some tannin structure to it. But generally they're quite fine. Not like a big red wine or dry your mouth off tannin, but sometimes it could be just in the front of your gums and your teeth where you just feel a little bit furriness and it's there. In general, I'm speaking in general too, the last two are really kind of associated and bound together. And I think that's really true in any wine, is that the more sweetness you have, generally the lower alcohol you have. And the more alcohol, probably the less sweetness, because the sweetness is directly tied to the amount of sugar, which is in the grapes upon harvest. And as you all know, many of you know more better than me, bake bread or fermentation things and kombucha, etc., is that yeast loves to eat sugar. That is the food. So as yeast eats sugar, the byproduct of that are alcohol, CO2, and heat. So if the drier style of wines will produce wines that have a little bit more increased alcohol. Generally, though, rosés are hovering anywhere between 12% to 14% alcohol. And if they do have a little bit of residual sugar to them, which means that not all the sugar was fermented out, you probably see wines anywhere from that 10 degrees alcohol, 9, 10, but that's not necessarily common in a lot of regions, but it is there. But if there is some sweetness, there is kind of a regional acceptance in some wines, and honestly, a lot of winemakers will leave a little bit of residual sugar because it makes wines that are a little bit easier to drink. Rosé d'Anjou, let's say, for instance, from the Loire Valley of France, is very common to find wines that have a little bit of sweetness to them because they're a little bit easier to drink if they have a little bit of sugar. Certainly wines from the US, there's a lot of wines that have sugar. I think a lot of the wineries and marketing firms have figured out that people like a little bit of sweetness in their wines. So generally speaking, a lot of rosés will have like 2 to 4 grams of residual sugar in them, which is almost not perceivable. But above that, maybe if you get up to 10, that would be considered sweet. And you could think like Mosel Riesling type of cabinet level, but they are noticeably sweet. Which would kind of segue into this next slide here, and the sweeter styles versus the dry styles. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to look on my iPad because your wonderful faces cover up what I'm trying to see. Okay, so here, this semi-sweet rosé category, which would be Rosé d'Anjou, White Merlot, which I haven't had one of those in a really long time, Garnacha, maybe from the area of Spain and the central area of Spain, La Mancha and/or Rioja, perhaps have a little bit of residual sugar, or on the sweeter side. Certainly, White Zinfandel, and I'll touch on that in a second, which is common in the US, is very prevalent. But like I mentioned earlier, dry rosés are the most common, of course. And Sangiovese or anything from Provence, not on here, I don't think, is Nebbiolo, which I think makes absolutely beautiful style of rosé, as well as Nerello Mascalese from the region of Etna in Sicily. Beautiful styles of dry rosé, which would be kind of bordering between these savory and fruity and floral characteristics. But I think with time, as you taste more and more, you can kind of discover which style is more for you. I always tend to gravitate more towards these fruity and floral, but if we have a barbecue and there's some grilled meats and there's char on a piece of meat, or something that's got some sugar on it also, I like to go in that sweet and kind of meaty style of wines. Are there any questions though so far before I get into the history or bore you some more with the other rosé stuff? I hope you're all drinking. We didn't even have a proper cheers. I'm very sorry. I'm so nervous. Cheers. I need to drink.
Cheers.
I see some of you having rosé. Good job. I'm proud of you. Complimenting.
I have a question. What is blush wine? Blush wine?
Blush wine is also a term that's used often in the United States for very inexpensive bulk wine that is likely blended and probably either served in a box or got a handle, and it comes in 3 liters and it's like a jug.
Okay.
So blush wine is often synonymous with like white Zinfandel and white Merlot. That these could be the categories outside of Europe, of course, that would be very cheaply made and made for mass production and have a lot of residual sugar to them. So blush wine is kind of considered that, if you will.
Thanks.
Of course, thank you.
Ciao. Hi.
Hey, ciao, Nico.
Ciao. How you doing?
Good.
I don't know. I know it's in Italy. It's not allowed to add sugar to wines in general. How is it in the States or in other countries? Since you mentioned like residual sugar and like making wine more adapted to.
Yeah. Thank you. So sorry, I didn't explain how you can leave residual sugar. Is that sometimes wines are chilled very quickly so that the yeasts are not allowed to continue being active. So oftentimes the fermenters, the more modern fermenters, have sleeves that have cooling coils around them, glycol, if you will, so they can chill the fermentation and essentially stops anything other activity. So the remaining is residual sugar. However, you're right, in Europe, not necessarily able to add actual sugar to wines. In some cases with chaptalization, it is allowed in certain regions and certain wines, and certainly depends on the region and their disciplinary, the laws that are written in. You can add some sugar. Although there's ways around that. Here in Italy, they're using like mosto, or like, really concentrated grape juice that has a lot of sugar, and that could legally be blended in to create some sweetness. But if we talk of wines from the United States that have very relaxed laws, you can absolutely add sugar without having to claim that or tell anybody that you did that. Wine manipulation is rampant, and you don't have to be transparent about it. You can basically, as long as you're not using chemicals and they don't harm people, you can almost add anything you want, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. Outside of Europe is kind of like a, free reign. But, then it comes down to winemaker and winery ethics. So of course that leads into purchasing and finding producers that you think have the right ethical practices and are small, or, etc. Thank you for the question. Okay, so a very brief history, because this is quite long in a sense. Going to you saw that one. The very old history, let's say, if I'm going to talk about history in about 4 minutes, that the ancient Greeks, we're talking about 600 or 700 before Christ, we're probably the first to make wine, I guess, if you will, and the Phoenicians also. But the early wines, thousands of years ago, were likely to be pink. Now, there's no concrete evidence, but evidence would suggest that these wines that they were producing for hundreds and hundreds of years were pink wines, because there was, there's 2 things. One, that the way that they're making the wines with generally foot pressing, extracted the juice, but not necessarily a lot of the color, because there wasn't a lot of contact with the skins themselves. And or in the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, there was a lot of water added to the wine. In fact, that they thought diluting wine was the civilized thing, so adding water to their red wines, to watering them down, was the more civil thing to do, and barbarians were those who drank wine undiluted, and the barbarians and the people that were likely thugs or etc. back in the day were ones who drank undiluted wines. And now, thank God, that's not true, because we like the alcohol aspect of it. But that is kind of the philosophy, and that was held true all the way through through the Romans. But I think the Romans started to figure it out that you can really enjoy some wine without adding water to it. But in the 6th century before Christ, so 600 BC, the Phocaeans brought the grapes and winemaking to what is now known as Marseille. There they called it Massalia. And from that point is where the culture of course, winemaking, but also diluting the wines was spread through that area of the kind of the French Riviera, the Provence region around Marseille, and up through the Rhone. And fast forward several hundred years to when the Romans claimed stake in that area. The Romans were probably the ones that most helped Rosé spread throughout the world. Although at the time it was only in the Mediterranean countries and other parts of the Roman Empire. So we're talking, going into Bordeaux or even up into Germany, all of wherever they had their outposts, if you will. These types of wines were very common. I'm sorry, we're getting our vegetable delivery. Paula's going to get that. And these were often considered in that area in Marseille and around, were considered more peasant wines because they were wines for the people. They were spread. You could increase the volume and give this type of wine to a lot more people if you added water to them. So that's kind of where the foundation of pink wine started, and the culture kind of maintained that in and around Provence. And that's really where the heart of Rosé began, and it still continues today, to be honest. Fast forward to the kind of the 19th century, many of the wealthy French and even the people who could afford it were spending their spare time and leisurely time on the French Riviera. And that helped propagate these pink wines into the kind of the mainstream of the French culture, moving up into the cities of Paris, and again spreading out into the Mediterranean. So this rosé-like lure was synonymous with beach, was synonymous with this leisure lifestyle, and the savoir-faire, if you will. My French is horrible. Excuse me if there's anyone who speaks French here. But it was kind of the lifestyle that was attached to it. So this was almost like one of these early marketing campaigns, but it just started grassroots because of the location of where it was on the French Riviera, on the Mediterranean. And then, is what people drank there. And in this particular picture, I like this one because there's an ice bucket here. And if you're ever in that area, you're drinking Provençal Rosé, is not frowned upon to add ice to your wine. And I love that because it's a simple act, but some people would hemorrhage if they saw you adding ice to the wine. And to me, it's such a why not kind of thing. You're keeping your wine cold, you dilute it a little bit yourself, but it's just so refreshing when that happens. So anyway, I'm going to fast forward now. Again, the rosé wine kind of spread out through most of the Mediterranean by that point. And now I'm going to fast forward into more modern production and kind of post-World War II. So there was a lot of increased mechanical winemaking machines, if you will. And you could make and start to manipulate a lot of different wines. And there was two wines that kind of changed the history of rosé. The one on the right is from Portugal, and in fact is still made today, as well as another wine is called Lancers. Those were together in in the earliest forms of rosé that hit the mass market for export all over the world. Mateus as well as Lancers are very sweet, and they are wines that sometimes are sparkling. I guess it depends on the batch. And they absolutely took reign, let's say in the United States and Canada and things of that nature, where people love the sweetness to them and created this whole category that was not once before. So these wines are pink, they were easy to drink, and they were quite sweet. Fast forward to kind of the mid 1960s, Bob Trinchero from the north coast of California was started to experiment with a wine that he actually had a disaster with. So basically he was making Zinfandel, which is this grape here, which is kind of California's native grape, even though it comes from Croatia, had a stuck fermentation. And the result of that is having a wine, a huge vat of wine that had a lot of sugar left in it. Instead of throwing it away or doing something with it, he decided to bottle it and put it into market. And this is what it came up with, the white Zinfandel, which, quite frankly, my parents drank and was the first wine that Paolo really got drunk on and that I remember. So there's a story for you too. Obviously sweet. And this now is definitely a wine that they're adding sugar to. There's no doubt about it. And it's just mass market, but it appeals to a lot of people. And at one point in time in the 90s and early 2000s, almost every restaurant in the US, Canada, had this wine on the list. Not necessarily Sutter Home, it was Beringer also, but wines that were pink, they were easy to drink and sweet. But this is the fall of rosé at the same time. Maybe not necessarily in Europe because the culture here maintained, but outside of here, if anyone was exposed to this wine or, Mateus, was how people viewed rosé as being sweet and not necessarily very interesting. So the marketing company, this was the early form of marketing, Jimi Hendrix drinking Mateus. There was also some pictures of the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, also drinking it. So I tried to help bring it back again, but I think it really struggled for a long time. Fast forward to the mid 2000s, let's say early 2000s, mid 2000s. Really, the interest in this culture and the European culture really took hold across the world, I think, and everything that was happening here really was gaining popularity outside of Europe, and that's where rosé is just now skyrocketed through the roof as far as the categories. Early 2010 plus is when many of the social media people, the influencers, Instagram was coming to age, Facebook took rosé to another level. So those that were vacationing on the French Riviera, let's say, or anywhere on the Mediterranean coast, drinking rosé, showing all their friends what they were doing, really helped catapult rosé wine to what it is now today, which is much more accessible, so many options. I mean, thousands of rosés from all over the world. There's really no place that doesn't make rosé, honestly, but there are many that are known for it. So just some quick facts. Let me see, what do I have next? Okay, current trends. There you go. Well, let me go back one, sorry. Rosé category accounts for 10% of the total production in 2017. Who makes the most is France, that's 28% of their total production, and then the US produces about 17%. Spain, and then Italy, so 10% of Italian production is Rosé or Rosato. The largest exporters, however, are Spain and Italy. That corresponds with their not necessarily consuming very much. The French consume undoubtedly the absolute most. They consume 33% of what they produce, and because they are the largest producer, that means they produce a lot and they drink a lot of rosé. Contrary here in Italy, only 5% of the public, there's only 5% of what they produce here is consumed domestically. Everything else is exported outside of this country. US, besides after France, is the second largest consumer. As you can imagine, the amount of people, and I was reading some statistics earlier that at least 50% of wine drinkers said they tried rosé in the last couple months. So that means that it's a really thriving category, and a lot of producers know that it's here to stay. Other current trends, it's growing basically production and consumption at over like 10% double digits every single year, which is pretty amazing. Dryness is definitely the style in which people prefer. Although, White Zinfandel, etc., that's still maintaining. What's going to change the market, and we're still waiting to hear when it's going to come through, is this Prosecco rosé. There's been a lot of already sparkling Prosecco, but you haven't been able to put that on the label. Basically, it's been just IGT, Vino Spumante Rosato, but last year the appellation passed a law that said that they will be able to start producing Prosecco appellated rosé, which Prosecco is already like, consumed all over the world, and there's almost 500 million bottles produced. There's probably going to be close to 1 billion with this rosé movement that's going to happen. It won't be Prosecco Superiore, it'll only be the DOC. So we should see that here soon, and that'll be Pinot Noir blended together with the Glera grape. And these DOCs and AOCs are specific to making rosé. So Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, which is made with the Montepulciano grape. Tavel, which is in the Rhone region of France, producing wines that are mostly Grenache-based. Rosé d'Anjou from the region of middle part of the Loire Valley, mostly made with Gamay or Brolu. And Bardolino in around this region of Lake Garda, which I'm drinking here now, is mostly Corvina or Corvione, grapes like that. So essentially you could use any grape to make a rosé wine as long as it's red. And really there's the movement here towards the less, it's not necessarily pretentious anymore. So it is a wine that they're trying to produce, and that it's creating this really easygoing style of wine, which I think has been quite beneficial for entering a lot of young people into drinking wine. Seeing it all over social media, etc. It's created a whole new wave of people that are consuming wine. So just real quick, because I love maps, I'll circle Provence here in the south part of France. The majority of rosés that are coming out of here are grapes like Grenache, of course, blended with a little bit of Syrah, white grapes, Clarets, Vermentino, it's called Roll there. And those same grapes are kind of in this Rhone region as well. So this whole area are those grapes. Same with the Languedoc-Roussillon. Bordeaux making some beautiful sparkling versions with Cremant de Bordeaux from Cabernet and Bordeaux varieties like Cabernet and Cabernet Franc. Loire Valley, like I just mentioned, more in this area are using Gamay grapes, or a native grape for this region, which is called Grolu. Sancerre is here using Pinot Noir. Burgundy, not necessarily known for making rosé, although there's one tiny appellation up here. It's called Marsanne, known to make rosé. Beaujolais a little bit. Champagne, of course, some of the most expensive wines on the market are Rosé de Champagne. Alsace, there's no ability to make still rosé, but they can make a sparkling from, which is a Cremant. In Italy, again, I'm sorry, because your beautiful faces are covering the bottom of the map, but you can see Abruzzo is probably Italy is most recognized in a sense, because it is the only appellation in Italy when it's Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, which suggests the name. It's the only appellation that says that it's going to be rosé on the label. If you saw that, you would know that it will be a rosé, even though it does look like it. Although the Chiaretto from here up and around Lake Garda, tons of consumption in this area, which is filled with tourists every summer, lined up and down the waters, drinking beautiful, refreshing rosé wines. Here in Piedmont, using grapes like Nebbiolo. Of course, Barbera is there because it has a lot of acidity, but a lot of the color bleeds through. But thin-skinned grapes like Sangiovese from Tuscany make really beautiful styles of rosé that I absolutely love. Campagna, and like I mentioned earlier, Norella Mascalese and around the region of Etna, making beautiful styles of rosé too. But outside of these two countries, I mean, literally every country in the world is making rosé. And there is no stop to the type of rosé, and there's really no sanctions around it. So you could see all different colors, all different styles, and it's really an interesting thing because this is what we see in the US, and these are wines that are in various types of formats. And from my previous world, when I was working for a distributor, canned wine is something of the future, and it's already taken wave in the US. I'm not sure if it'll ever come here through Europe, but it is an absolute way that you can consume and have a lot of wines and have them be casual. And it really appeals to a younger audience. You know, same with box wines. This is a wine from Portugal. This is one from the south of France. So they're really inventive in a lot of ways. These aren't just, you know, rosé wines that are in these types of vehicles, but all types of wines. And then, of course, the hashtags that are happening and events that are happening all over the world revolved around rosé. And I just love to be a part of it because I think is my favorite category. And I think it's really fun that it's such a polarizing, if you will, experience when you're having a pink party, let's say. I have a picture from a pink party. These were 3 of the events that I was involved in last. And there's whole parties that are revolved around just rosé. So we as a distributor would come and line up like this and have consumers come and just taste rosé. Everyone would dress in pink. And it was really a casual environment, and everyone had a fantastic time. It was really one of the greatest events of the year. This on the right is our distributor tasting that we had for our customers that were coming in. We opened in 100 different types of rosé, and everyone absolutely loved it. And now this is, I'll send this to everybody if you want to see it. These are just some of the wines that I've really enjoyed of late. Italy, I think, is going to slowly start consuming more rosés. The Slow Food Editore last year wrote for the first time the 100 best rosés in Italy. So I think the movement is coming here, although you can find a lot of rosés in various enoteche, but compared to other countries, I think it's really slow and not as many options as some regions. But you can find quite a bit online and various things like that. And then lastly, I have rosé with food. And I think rosé is one of the best blanket food pairing wines there is, meaning that it can cover a wide range of cuisines and styles. So anything that would pair with a white wine for food-wise, you could pair with rosé, as long as it doesn't have any tannin or it's very light and has a lot of acidity. Of course, classically, you would say because it does come from the coast, that coastal-like food is the most typical food pairing, you could say. But outside of that, I think there's so many other applications for it. A darker rosé or Ceresuolo Abruzzo or something from Tavel, or anything that has a little bit of sweetness could be paired really well with foods that are fresh off the grill that have a char. And you could think of the color scheme. So the lighter the color, the more delicate the dish. The more dark the color, the more rich the dish could be. And if you find some off-dry versions of rosé, they could absolutely be paired with spicy food like Thai, anything from Asia that has a lot of chili spice or even curry, things of that nature. Tacos. I mean, right? We miss tacos dearly. So if anyone's in US right now, Mexico, anywhere, please eat some tacos for us, for me. Thank you. And of course, the classic pairing on the bottom is garlic aioli and bouillabaisse, which is from Provence. So I probably run my time. I'm not really sure. That's all I have from this end, from Bra, from Piazza Roma. Any questions or any final thoughts?
Hi, Scott.
Sorry, go ahead. Go
ahead.
No,
I was just making a joke that I'm going to eat a lot of tacos and rosé for you, Scott.
Thank you. Please.
And Paula.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very appreciative of you and your help and your commitment. Thank you.
Do you have any local Piemontese or even Lange Rosé you prefer or you have tasted that they're pretty particularly good?
Yeah, there's quite a few. There's one I really love. It's called Pico Macario. Actually, it's not in my list. I could send you that. They make one which is it's made with Barbera. The GD Vira makes a fantastic Nebbiolo Rosé. There's more coming down the pike. Let me do some research. I'll send you a separate list if you'd like, Isak, so you can have it. One I especially love is from Gattinara. There's a producer called Nervi. They were recently purchased by Conterno, which is one of the most well-known Barolo producers here. But they bought them in Gattinara, is north of Torino, just a little bit. But they're producing wines that are a lot like Barolo Barbaresco because they are made with Nebbiolo and they're fantastic. But they make a really great rosé also, somewhere in the range of like 15 euros or so.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know if you already talked about it because I joined the lesson like at 7, so sorry if I repeat something.
No problem.
My question was about the people perception of rosé, which is not often like taken seriously as a wine. It's in my experience, I've seen that it's often seen as a wine for not competent people. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah.
So how do you think that could change? Do you think it's changing already, or?
I definitely think it is changing. Sorry, you want to see my reminders. I definitely think that's changing because it's, well, I think it's slow to change, honestly, in several markets. But I think the realization is happening because there's producers that are now producing wines that are quite expensive and they're quite age-worthy as well. And that realization might get the attention of those connoisseurs, if you will, that will perhaps, only drink white wine, only drink red, or they only drink white Burgundy, or, Bordeaux, or, the very expensive wines. But the wines that you can lay down and age for a little bit is usually a testament to a wine of high quality that could command the price. Yeah. And normally those prices will pull a category up and pull up the perception of a wine or a category of a wine that will make it more, viable and valorize it. But I also do think that rosé, in a sense, as a category, will remain a very casual category. It's a wine that's perfect for the beach or hot weather, or a patio, or just easy drinking with your friends, or an aperitivo. And so I think it's going to have these. I think the producers are going to have to maybe define it themselves to make their wines realize that they are serious. Because in a sense, the category will probably remain with this casual vibe for a long time. But once people experience it with certain food pairings, I believe, or producers, they could really pull the category up. And a funny story, not necessarily funny, and I know we're going late, but I had to do a project last year in the Wine Masters of a marketing project, come up with something and pitch it. So I thought of the idea of Sassicaia Rosé, which I don't know if you know Sassicaia here, Tenuto San Guido. They're one of the more expensive, notable Tuscan producers, and a bottle of Sassicaia is like 200 euros or whatever. And it's really known all throughout the world as being one of the great wines. And it was the first Super Tuscan. So my project was that now Sassicaia makes a rosé, and they were going to charge 100 euros for it. And it was far-fetched, I think, in my mind. But I don't know if it's too far off with some of these really notable producers from different regions making something like this, because there are so many producers have seen the value of it, honestly. Did that answer your question? It's probably really long-winded. I apologize.
No. Perfect answer. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, if there's no more questions, I'd like to just...
I want to say one thing. Maybe there is a book which can be useful for rosé wines. It's edited by Slow Wine team and Slow Food Editore, and it's called 100 Italian rosé wines.
You see?
It's a wine guide.
This one here, see?
Which one?
This one, can you see it?
Oh, yeah. This.
Yeah.
There is also an English version. Do you know it?
No, I don't believe there is. It's only
No, okay.
No.
Sorry, I didn't see it at all.
Yeah, you can. I breezed right through it, but you can practice your Italian with it. It gives you a lot of. You can practice all of your red fruits and everything, and the Italian adjectives. That I love doing that. Well, if there are no more questions, I wish you all health and safe travels. And I know these are trying times, and that's why I think Rosé was proper for me to approach this subject, because it gives me a lot of hope that we'll come out of this and we'll have times with conviviality with our friends around the world. And it might be a few months away, but Rosé makes everything better, in my opinion. So
we'll have a pink party.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes, I love it.
Guys, if Scott is willing to share this presentation with all of us, so we kindly ask you to send through the chat your email so that we can send it to you.
Okay.
To whoever wants.
Now in the chat?
Yes, now in the chat. And we can collect all the emails and send it to everyone. Not to spam everyone with studenti and whatever.
And we would like to thank you very much, Scott, for participating, and also with this very short notice of time and putting this together and entertaining us all. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity and you having me and thinking of me. And again, like I said, it's a subject that I love, and why not try to spread the word? And if I made a rosé, this is where I would plug my own, but I don't. So anyway, there's a list of people that you can find that make beautiful styles of rosé from all over the world, and I think it's fun. So thank you all, and I really appreciate your time and attention and questions, interaction, and I hope to be able to catch up here again soon.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank
you. Bye, guys.
Arlette, I have to ask you, or Hilda, do you want me to just send you the presentation and then you could email it to everybody, or how do you want me to do that?
Yeah, that could be an option, or we can send you all the emails, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, you can send them to me. I'll send them. It'll probably be a Google Docs link because it has so many pictures in it that it'll just be a lighter file that way. You can share it that way.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Scott.
My pleasure.